In this video, we're going to look for evidence of those 4 traditional risk assessment activities in our quantitative risk assessment for Vibrio parahemolyticus in oysters. And we're going to find that is a lot easier to do. Again, reviewing quickly, the National Research Council, when asked to define the risk assessment process back in 1983, said it had 4 steps: hazard identification, dose response, exposure assessment, and risk characterization. We're looking at the table of contents for the Vibrio risk assessment, and right now you can see highlighted the hazard identification section. This is very clearly related to the National Research Council activity. If we scroll down just a little bit, you'll find the second section is subtitled dose response. It's the hazard characterization part of the report. And if I scroll down a little bit further, you'll see the exposure assessment, and a little further still, and we get the 4th step, risk characterization. So let's take a look now momentarily at the model overall. Let me shrink this down a little bit for you so we can get it all on one page. Here is a layout of the calculation model. So here this gives us a little opportunity to talk about how we use the word risk assessment model. Up until now, in this part of the course, we've been talking about a conceptual model. What are the steps that are present in all risk assessments? But then once you get into a risk assessment, especially quantitative risk assessment, you will find that there are different calculations, different things that are done for each of the conceptual risk assessment model steps. So, for example, in this Vibrio model, beginning with water temperature and all of these steps down through and including the number of pathogenic Vibrio parahemolyticus per serving at consumption, all of these steps are all part of the exposure assessment. They are explaining what needs to happen in order for a person to become exposed to a pathogenic Vibrio parahemolyticus microbe when they eat oysters. So the shaded symbols are all part of the exposure assessment. Right here where we're looking at this little rectangle, this is the dose-response relationship. Feeding into it would be hazard characterization data. So these 2 elements right here, the human clinical studies, surveillance data, and the dose-response relationship, they would comprise the hazard characterization piece of the risk assessment. Risk characterization is given by the risk of illness per serving here, the frequency of servings, and the risk of illness per year. So the last 3 symbols would show us that part of the calculation model that supports the risk characterization. So let me go back, if I may, to our table of contents and click briefly on each of these sections. The hazard identification, you can see here the hazard identification component is the identification of the pathogenic microorganism, and here they very clearly state the hazard on which this risk assessment is focused is pathogenic Vibrio parahemolyticus in raw oysters. If we take a look, move on to the hazard characterization, you would find here a lengthy discussion of the dose-response relationship, which is a critical part of the hazard characterization. But there would be a great deal of other information, the human clinical feeding studies that provide the data for the dose response, and it would go on with the scientific information. So there is clearly that second step. The exposure assessment begins here. This is the story of how people become exposed to those Vibrio parahemolyticus. And then of course, the risk characterization step. So all four steps are present in both of our case studies. In Glimmerous, they look a good bit different than they do here because the food safety community very closely parallels and still uses that traditional model that was developed by the National Research Council back in 1983. So our takeaway is simply this. Every risk assessment is going to look a little bit different, but every risk assessment in some way or in some form addresses the four steps in the generic model that we're using. You would identify the hazard or the opportunity. You would assess the consequences. You would assess the likelihood of those consequences occurring, and then you would pull all of that good analysis together in a risk characterization step that is designed to answer the questions that risk managers are asking of their risk assessors.